For the second time this year, the unemployment rate has risen instead of falling. 3 years after the recession ended, unemployment is still at 6.8%, an 18-year high. Joining me now to analyse the figures is Economist Matt Nolan from Infometrics. Good morning to you, Matt. I see these numbers show another 2,000 people out of work. Why?
Well, first thing I'll do is I'd step back and I'd say, okay, this June figure's quite large. How was March? That was quite large as well. How are we looking overall? Because these numbers jump around a lot. And the underlying picture is one of elevated unemployment. And we've seen that persistently for quite a period of time. So when you look at it that way, you have to draw conclusions that bring you to something that's been persistent. The financial crisis, the debt crisis, the uncertainty that's caused for firms. Firms don't want to hire because of that international crisis.
But where does Christchurch factor into this? We're starting to rebuild our second biggest city. You could presume that there would be some jobs being created.
Oh, definitely, and there will be jobs created, but we've only just started to rebuild it. There's still a lot of spare capacity amongst the people in the construction industry. The labourer unemployment rate is still very high. So at the moment, you can pull people in. Hours worked in that industry are still quite low, so you can get the same employees just working a bit longer.
The data earlier this week showed that the number of hours worked was rising. So is that to say employers aren't hiring new people, they're just making their current staff work harder?
Well, the two surveys actually gave us very different indications about what was going on there. The quarterly employment survey on Tuesday said there was a big lift in hours worked. The HLFS, the Household Labour Force survey, said there was only a small one. Now, if you averaged them out, there was still a bit of an increase, and that's the most encouraging part of this release. Hours worked is a leading indicator for the labour market. It tells us that firms are looking at increasing output. Okay, so when we see hours work picking up, that's a good thing.
But we also saw 16,000 people leave the labour force, opt out. So these figures could have been worse, couldn't they?
They could have been, but a lot of that is what I'll just call noise. It's just the data moving around because it's a survey, because there's some error there. In reality, we don't know whether people really left or came in. We just know that the labour force participation rate is still very high historically. There are still a lot of people in the labour force, which is part of the reason why unemployment seems so high. There are people out there motivated and willing to work.
We don't yet have the figures for how the economy fared through this same period. So what do you think that this unemployment figure tells us about how the economy might have been doing?
Well, I think it gives us part of the picture, saying potentially things weren't quite as strong as we might have expected, but there's a lot of other indicators saying household spending's been picking up. Manufacturing activity's been picking up a bit, so there's a lot of drivers that should see some growth in this quarter. The economy could well be picking up, even though the labour market isn't.
Now, we know the Reserve Bank's keeping interest rates on hold at 2.5%, a record low for a long time yet. But do these figures change anything for them?
I don't think the figures will really change how they feel. They might say, okay, in the past, potentially, we should have done a bit more. But right now, we're seeing lending pick up. We're seeing household spending and house sales pick up. As a result, we feel like our stimulatory conditions we're providing through low interest rates are appropriate.
When's your pick, Matt, of when this unemployment rate might start coming down?
I think we'll start seeing it tick down over the second half of the year. But it'll still be very slow. By the end of next year, it could well still be over 6%, which is a high unemployment rate.
It absolutely is. Thank you very much for your time and your comments. That is Matt Nolan, an economist at Infometrics.